Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawala. Assalamu alaikum everyone and good morning. Thank you Mullah Saleh for the amazing introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here to present on Maulana Taha Abderrahmane, who is definitely my favorite thinker. So let me get straight into my presentation and talk about one of Taha Abderrahmane's books, which is called Uṣūl al-Ḥiwār wa Tajdīd al-Kalām, which means on the principles of dialogue and the renewal of theology. So this is a book on discourse theory and linguistics, and it's extremely important in Taha's intellectual project, but at the same time, it's criminally understudied by serious readers of Taha, especially in the West. So this was what sort of motivated me to spend my winter break last year translating the entire book into English. So my presentation is really just going to be on some results that Taha found in the book and that I found interesting, and we'll talk about that. But before getting into the book itself, let me first explain what the big picture of my presentation is. So here are some philosophical motivations behind Taha developing a modern Islamic conception of discourse theory. But first of all, what is discourse theory? So discourse theory is a science which gives you a set of tools that we can then use to employ, to analyze our communicative practices with other people. So this could be verbal, which means how we talk with each other, and it could also be textual, which means how an author might write to the reader. Taha, as some people might know from Wael Hallaq's amazing book on him, is developing the idea of an Islamic modernity. So his central claim is that we must distinguish between two things. Firstly, the spirit of modernity, which is ruhul hadatha, and the manifestation or the reality of modernity, which is waqi' al-hadatha. And the spirit of modernity is something that has universal characteristics. And this spirit exists in every civilization and in every age. But Taha is also saying that the modernity that we're seeing now, that we're facing now, is a specific manifestation of this spirit, which is the Western manifestation of modernity, which has its roots in the Enlightenment. So then for Taha, the Islamic civilization, which also has this spirit of modernity, can also create its own manifestation of modernity in order to displace the Western form of it, which is essentially secular and materialist in nature. So for Taha, what the engine that really undergirds Islamic modernity is discourse, because what brings modernity to its fruition is knowledge production, and this essentially relies on discourse. So in order to do this, we must first begin by trying to displace theoretical reason, which is the idol of the Enlightenment, with what Taha calls Sufi praxis or practices. And from here we can extract two aspects of what Taha wants Islamic modernity to be. So the first is that it must be ethical, and the second is that it must be operative, or he says tawjihi, which means directive, which means that it must lead to people actually performing actions as a result. So it's not just theoretical in nature. So Taha wants to develop a discourse theory that fulfills both of these conditions. So it must be ethical and it must be directive, where in this model of discourse theory, we're assuming that both the speaker and the interlocutor are ethical agents, and they're acting on a shared set of ethical values, such as mutual respect, tolerance, etc. So all these values would then have a deeper impact on his interlocutor and to move him towards action, which is where the praxis comes in. And the reason Taha is doing this is because the model of discourse that we have in Western modernity is reductively materialist and secular. So they don't really care about ethics or anything transcendent or sacred. And we shall see an example of this after this. So what Taha is doing is he's trying to provide an alternative. And another motivation for Taha is that he wants to displace demonstrative or burhani reason with argumentative or hijaji reason, which for Taha, the latter is actually superior. And finally, for Taha, he views language as something that's embedded in reality. So what this means is that language is not just, this correspondence of singular words with singular meanings. Instead, it has this thing which Taha calls the shabaka ad-dalaliyya, which means like the semantic web, where words and meanings are interconnected with each other and interwoven with each other in a web-like structure. And this last idea is by no means new or novel to Taha, because we see it very prominently in the Western tradition, especially in the later Wittgenstein. For example, in his book, Philosophical Investigations, he brings in the concept of like language games, and then there's the famous example of the slap. And so Taha is really building on all of this. So here's like a wall of text from Halak's amazing book. I'm not going to read any of it out, but I've highlighted the important point in bold. But the point that I want to make about Taha's project is that it's not similar at all to like a postmodern deconstructive project that tries to level literally everything down to discourse and say that everything is amenable to critique, and that there's really no objective truth, and that truth is really what you get from critique. Instead, and this is like the kind of like materialist or secular model of discourse that happens in Western modernity or postmodernity, which I was talking about before. And this is not what Taha wants. So for Taha, instead, he's saying that there are some truths that are beyond critique. But in order to get there, we must first begin by building a base. And that base for Taha is discourse theory. So for Taha, he's building outwards from discourse theory instead of leveling everything down, which is like the sort of postmodern deconstructive project. And there are also some practical motivations for developing a discourse theory. Firstly, we use discourse theory to evaluate things in the Islamic tradition, taqweem al-turath. And Taha makes it clear that he's not trying to modernize or rationalize the tradition. But the idea here is that if you want to analyze something, the tools that you use for this analysis must itself be stronger than the object of your analysis. So the Islamic tradition has its own methods of reasoning and linguistic analysis. But in order for us to analyze this, we must develop a stronger version of it so that then we can use the stronger version to look at this object of analysis. The second thing is that the influence that debate or munazara had as an enterprise in the Islamic tradition simply cannot be overstated. Almost all of the Islamic sciences in some way or form is related to debate or munazara. And munazara is essentially two things. It is semantic, dalali, and argumentative, istidlali, which is exactly what discourse theory is trying to study. So thus, it allows us access to analyze a very large domain of the Islamic sciences. And finally, we must note something important, which is that the intellectual production that happens within the Islamic tradition was actually an outcome of a collective participation of individuals within a community. So like, for example, we might look at a book, from the Turath and see like only a sole author on the cover, but really like the knowledge that is contained in that book is something that the author got from interacting with other people in his community or responding to them. And all of this happens through discourse. And this is what discourse theory is trying to analyze and take into account as well. So if all of what I said is true, then what Taha wants to argue is that the vast majority of texts in our tradition has this inferential nature to them, because there is some like internal logic to them, because when these scholars wrote their books, they were arguing for something or responding to someone. So this internal logic is really what we're trying to bring out when we use discourse theory to evaluate things within our tradition. So this is what Taha calls an inferential text, or nas istidlali, and this is Taha positing some conditions and formalizing what these conditions might be. So the details of this aren't really important at all, but this is simply like to give a taste of what you might find in the book fi Uṣūl al-Hiwār. But all of this that Taha does is in order to create the most general picture of what an inferential text might look like, and then we can subject different texts within our tradition to this general picture or format in order to bring out the implicit reasoning that exists within these texts. And this is simply a continuation of that, where basically Taha is saying like we can classify these texts into different modes of reasoning, like progressive, regressive, explicit, implicit, etc. So now let's talk about what kind of tools that Taha is using to develop discourse theory. So first of all, we acknowledge the things that are given to us in our tradition, which is Aristotelian logic and adab al-bahth wal-munazara, which is the science or the etiquette of debate and dialectics. But then we go beyond this by using pragmatics, which is something that we find in modern linguistics, and dialogical logic, which is like a fairly recent form of modern logic. So what exactly is pragmatics? So if you think about linguistics, right, there's essentially 3 levels to linguistics. So at the lowest level, you have what's called syntax, which is just about how it's about the relationship between different signifiers or different symbols or different words. And it's basically how do you manipulate these words together and put them together. And the next level above syntax is semantics. And this looks at the relationship between words and their meaning. And both of these levels are things that can be captured by, for example, Aristotelian logic or adab al-bahth wal-munazara. But then pragmatics is like a higher level than this, where you try to look at the relationship between a statement and the person that interprets that statement. And this is because, like, when you say a statement to someone, to different people, for example, so different people have different background knowledge, and all of them will interpret that statement differently. Or you could, for example, like say the same statement, but like in different contexts. And then people will interpret it differently in different contexts. So pragmatics is the level where you try to take into account all of those differences. And then dialogical logic is basically a type of logic which emphasizes the process of reasoning that happens in an interactive dialogue between, like 2 speakers, 2 interlocutors, rather than looking at the structure of an argument, which is what you have in the syntactic approach, or the meaning of an argument, which is what you have in semantic logic. And we'll see dialogical logic in action in a little bit. But first, I just want to quickly show a summary of what adab al-bahth wal-munazara would look like, the etiquette of debate and dialectic. So it's basically the science that studies the different roles of a speaker in a debate. So specifically, like what kinds of argumentative moves that are valid or invalid in that debate. So for example, if I make a particular kind of statement, only certain types of responses towards it would be considered valid and fair. And for example, if I'm trying to refute something, then there are also specific types of refutations that are valid and fair, depending on the statement that I'm trying to refute. So this is essentially what it's trying to capture. Now, Taha is going to take this concept and try to incorporate it in modern dialogical logic. And again, like the details of this, it's not important at all, but this is just like to show how Taha is like formalizing and engaging with both of these sciences together. So now let's look at a couple of examples that put dialogical logic in action. So the first example, so suppose you want to verify the validity of the following argument. If the universe does not require a cause, mu'athir, then it is not temporal, muhdath, because if it requires a cause, then it is temporal. This is like, an argument that you might see in any Kalām or theology book. So then what we do in dialogical logic is we first regiment this argument, which basically means that we just translate it from natural language into a symbolic format, which is what we have in the second bullet point. So if P, then Q, then if not P, then not Q. Where P denotes the universe requires a cause, and Q denotes the universe is temporal. And then this is what it will look like in dialogical logic, where we're mapping out the interactive dialogue that happens in that debate. So the claimant starts by claiming something on line 2. If not P, then not Q. And then the objector can respond to that in several different ways. But in this case, he responded in a specific way that would only allow a specific set of responses from the claimant in line 4. So then they basically go back and forth until the debate ends at line 7, because the claimant can no longer make any further argumentative moves. And this is called ifham in adab al-bahth. And here's another quick example, and we'll go through this and then I'll explain what the upshot of this is. So suppose you want to verify the validity of the following argument. If the universe relies on something pre-eternal, qadim, and anything that relies on something pre-eternal is itself pre-eternal, then the universe is pre-eternal. And again, this is like a classic example of what you might find in any Kalām book, possibly an argument given by one of the falasifa. So again, we start by trying to translate the natural language form of the argument into symbolic notation, which is what you have in the second bullet point. So then the claimant starts on line 2 by saying E bracket U, which is basically the universe is eternal. Then the objector tries to question this, right, on line 3, and they go back and forth before the debate finally terminates on line 11, where the objector is then forced to admit that E bracket U, the universe is eternal, which is exactly the same thing as what the claimant was saying in line 2. So this is what is called ilzam, where he's compelled. So this model of modern discourse theory that Taha is developing is something that would allow us to commit to the rules of adab al-bahth wal-munazara in stipulating what are the types of argumentative moves that an interlocutor could make, while also at the same time being extremely precise in showing how a dialogue happens between two people. So that at the end of it, we can conclusively say that, yes, like this debate has ended and one of them has successfully compelled the other through like valid argumentative moves. And so that is like the upshot of Taha developing this modern dialogical logic. So now I want to like switch gears a bit and look at a separate issue in the book, which is a case study of the problem of identity. So here what Taha is essentially doing is he's trying to displace demonstrative reason, burhani, with argumentative reason, hijaji. And he's providing this case study as an example. And the argument that Taha is trying to make is that Taha is claiming that munazara, or Islamic debate, is the reasoning method par excellence. And you can see this being manifested very clearly in the science of Kalām, or theology. And in the books of Kalām, there's a discussion about the problem of identity, which really stems from discussions about how exactly essences and attributes relate to each other, or how human attributes and divine attributes are dissimilar to each other. So Taha's claim is that the mutakallimun, the theologians, through just the process of debate, they arrived at results which were very similar to the kinds of results that we see modern logicians arrived at as they analyze the same problem of identity. And this is like a very long-standing problem in logic. So people like Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, etc., from the mid-19th century onwards, so they used modern symbolic logic in their analysis. But then Taha is saying, look, the mutakallimun, they did it a few hundred years earlier through just like munazara, and they arrived at very similar conclusions. And we can see this problem of identity in many works of Kalām. But I chose an example that I thought that everyone might be familiar with, which is Taftazani's Sharh al-Aqaid, where he says, like la mumathala illa bil musawa min jami' al-wujuh. Like there's no identity except through equality in all aspects. And so he's sort of like explaining that this is a view that he attributes to the Ash'aris, but like that's a separate question. But what I want to show here is that that there exists this discussion in Kalām about how do we interpret what does identity mean, right? And this is something that mutakallimun were very aware of. So in general, in Kalām, there was a split into like 4 different groups depending on how they interpreted what identity must be. So some of them said that identity is like all attributes being shared, or some of them said that it's only some attributes, or some of them said that it's only the essential ones, etc. So then what Taha did was like he took all of this and he regimented them and translated them into symbolic logic notation. And again, like the details of this isn't really that important, but like as someone who's specializing in logic, I just like had to include it because I really just like appreciate this kind of work done by like a Muslim thinker. But what's really interesting here is that Taha is taking statements that we find in Kalām texts, which we might, like when we read them, we might think that they're unimportant or like unassuming, from just like a quick reading, but Taha, he's deriving like logical properties out of them, right? So for example, like statements like regarding the morphological scale of mufa'ala, or a statement like mithl al-mithl mithlun. So like to me, these statements are just like, unassuming, right? But then Taha is saying like, look, they are actually important logical properties that we can have like reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity, etc., which are like really important characteristics in modern logic. So again, like the symbolic notation, like the details isn't important at all, but I just wanted to show that Taha, what he did was that he formalized the 4 different types of identity that we saw earlier using like modern logical notations. And then here, we're able to build logical systems by positing what we had before. We posit them as definitions and axioms. And once we have a logical system, that means that we can begin like inferring further, like properties about these axioms. And this is like something very standard that you would do in modern symbolic logic. So then the end result is that what you get to see is what we have in the Kalām books, right? Where we saw yesterday that the early Kalām tradition, it was dialectical in nature. But then Taha here is trying to argue that they're actually really rigorous and precise. So because all we did just now was that we showed using modern methods of logic that you're able to bring out extremely precise and systematic, like the extremely precise and systematic nature of a production that was created through debate. So all of this is to say that notions that we have, like rigor, accuracy, precision, that we would typically only associate with demonstrative methods, they actually exist in dialectical methods as well. But it's just that we're unable to see them, and we're only able to bring it out with the lens of modern symbolic logic. So finally, Taha is doing all of this because he's trying to undermine the prejudice against argumentative reason that proponents of demonstrative reason might have. So Taha is explicitly setting himself up against modernist reformists like Muhammad al-Kun and Abid al-Jabiri and so on. So that's really all I have to present on this. Thank you for having me. Jazakumullah khairan for your attention.